Well, certainly the first part of the equation everyone's familiar with, right? I mean, you have your to-do list and it's, got 47 things on it and we are shocked that we do not get through it. And, we're always frustrated with ourselves. But it's also true that I have experienced in terms of, clients that I work with and just, folks that I know, oftentimes people feel hindered from even coming up with a long-term goal because they say, well, that might be nice, but I wouldn't know how to do that. How could I possibly get there? And, it feels impossible. But the reason it feels impossible is because, yes, it's impossible today. If it was your goal, like, oh yeah, I'm going to be an astronaut tomorrow. Like, no, that's not going to happen.
Right.
But if you come up with sort of, whatever the equivalent is of like, I'm going to do X in 10 years or 20 years, there is so much time in between here and there. The amazing secret that I think most people don't realize is you don't have to know how to get there. I mean, even if you knew how to get there, like right now, is it even rational to think that every single one of the 10,000 steps that you map out between now and the year 2045 is going to pan out exactly the way you think? Like, I doubt it. A lot of things happening in the world. So you don't have to know. All you need to know is what the ambition is and what the next step is. And you just keep taking one step in front of another. And eventually you actually either get there or you get pretty darn close.
Who are the world's most interesting people? And what fascinating, groundbreaking, incredible things can they teach us? In this new series, I leave our Science of People lab to interview my favorite authors, experts, and celebrities for them to share their best people hacks, social skills, and stories. And let me tell you, they have some juicy tips. This is a new series I'm calling The World's Most Interesting People.
Hello, YouTube friends. Today, we are talking about long-term thinking, strategic thinking, visionary leadership with the amazing Dorie Clark. Let me brag about Dorie for a second. Dorie Clark has been named one of the top 50 business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50 and was recognized as the #1 communication coach in the world by the Marshall Goldsmith Leading Global Coaches Awards. Clark, a consultant and keynote speaker, teaches executive education at Duke and Columbia, and she is the Wall Street Journal bestselling author of The Long Game, Entrepreneurial You, Reinventing You, and Stand Out, which was named as the #1 leadership book of the year by Inc. magazine. Welcome, Dorie.
Amazing. Vanessa, thanks for having me.
So just a little background for viewers. Dorie and I have crossed paths for years and years and years. We have so many mutual friends. We actually got to meet about 3 weeks ago. Dorie offered to help with cues. And so I'm just so excited to be able to chat with you today.
Thank you so much. It's so much fun for me. I wish that I had gone to South by Southwest and then I could have seen you in person, but soon.
Okay, so what I want today is your brain, you think so strategically about choices. And I devoured this book because I was like, we need more of this. And I want to start off with a shocking study that you started off in the book. And I totally agree with it. Here's what you found. So first of all, you defined strategic thinking beautifully, which I think everyone should pause and take note of. Strategic thinking is the ability to focus deliberately on long-term projects. You mentioned 97% of leaders identified strategic thinking as a key to their organization's success. Yet 96% said they don't have enough time to do strategic thinking at all. What? Tell me about this.
It is quite ironic. As I was delving deeper into the world of strategic thinking, what I came to realize is, there's pretty much no one out there that is an anti-strategic thinking constituency. It's not like there are people that are like, no, this sucks. This is terrible. You should never think strategically. I mean, it's pretty much like, okay, everybody agrees. Yes, this is good. This is important. It's kind of like, exercise, right? But the problem, much like exercise, is that we just don't do it, even when we know it's good for us. And so I really wanted to take a deep dive and understand the barriers and the obstacles that were getting in the way of us doing what we theoretically want to be doing and what we know is good for us.
Okay, so let's dive into it. And I love this quote that you had by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. We measure ourselves by what we feel capable of doing, while others measure us based on what we've done. For me, I think this is my barrier to strategic thinking. This exact quote. Tell me about sort of the myths, the traps that block us from getting to be strategic or long-term thinkers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many things that are at play. Sometimes many of them at once. The most obvious, which I consider sort of the tip of the iceberg, is just, we say, "Oh, but I can't think strategically. I've got too many meetings. I've got too many emails." And of course, yes, you're not wrong. Yeah, absolutely. We all suffer from it. That is true. But what's interesting is that in addition to those things, there are sometimes, it turns out, actually underlying emotional reasons why we crave busyness. As I was diving into the research, it turns out, number one, especially in American business culture, busyness is seen as a sign of status. And that's something we're often loath to give up, that we feel like, oh gosh, if I'm not busy, maybe I'm not important. I mean, this is not conscious, but at a subconscious level, many of us are driven by this. Also, frankly, we oftentimes use busyness as a means of avoiding either things we don't know how to do or just emotionally hard things. Am I in the right career? I don't know. I'll just work harder.
Yes. So, that busy section, it struck a chord in me, and I have reshared this with multiple people. You called out something that I think is a default mechanism, and it traps us, which is this. If we're starting our day and we're like, I want to feel important, the busier we are, the more important we feel. And also, we don't have to think about anything else. As you said, it's anesthetizing. So I realize what can happen to me is when I don't want to think strategically, I sit and try to tackle my task list. And I'm like, I'm important and numb. I'm important and I'm numb, important and numb. And those are a little bit addictive, those feelings. Like they keep you in that perpetual motion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't ask difficult questions if you are just constantly on the hamster wheel. That is correct.
Okay, so you gave very, very practical skills. And by the way, we are giving the general overview. You practically break down how this works and how we can tackle it. I want to take one section of this practical aspect, tasks. So you talk about task management, and you say that there are 4 questions that we should ask ourselves. Can I read those questions? Can you walk me through how you came up with these? So 1, should I be doing this task at all? 2, could I delegate it to someone else or stop doing it altogether? 3, where should I focus my effort in order to get the biggest return? And lastly, this one's so good. If I were starting fresh today, would I still choose to invest in this project? Those 4 questions, life-changing. Tell me, how did you come up with these?
Oh, well, thank you, Vanessa. I appreciate it. I mean, these in many ways are the questions that I try to be vigilant about asking myself. I mean, I am a big believer in checklists. I think it's easy for us. One of the biggest problems in how we get ourselves overloaded to begin with is we treat each request or each inbound inquiry as its own thing. You have to weigh it, you have to consider it. But and then you sort of spin and you stress out about maybe this, maybe that. But ultimately, we need to understand we've got to categorize things and we've got to make faster decisions. Otherwise, you really get tied up with it. And so just like a surgeon might feel like, oh, I've got this, I've done a million of them. It's still good to have the checklist just to make sure you don't leave the scalpel inside somebody's chest. You have an off day, you forget, and it's not good. And so we need a checklist to remind ourselves as well. So some of these things, just are things from the world of productivity. Should I be doing it all? That's just a good general question. The question about if I was starting over, would I do this, really comes from the world of psychology and economics. There's a concept known as sunk cost theory, which basically says, and this is true in a lot of investing, for instance, that if you put a lot of effort into something, you don't want to feel like your effort was in vain, your previous effort was in vain. And so you keep throwing more and more into it because you want it to come out good in the end. So you can tell yourself a good story about, oh, well, I worked so hard, but then there was a triumph. And it turns out sometimes that happens, but sometimes it's like, no, you should have quit. So you want to try to be wise enough to know the difference.
Okay. So by the way, I love your voice that you use to talk to yourself. I just love it. No, you should have quit. That's exactly how my voice sounds on the inside. So a couple of things here is one, I realized after asking myself these questions, I literally opened up my to-do list and I went through them. Should I be doing this task at all? No. Could I delegate to someone else? Yes, definitely. Where should I focus? That's when the question got a little harder. I also realized I default to yes. So it's actually harder for me to say no. And I think this is for most successful long-term thinkers. A lot of visionary leaders, they're visionary because they're saying yes to creative opportunities. And so in a weird way, the more visionary you are, the harder this kind of strategic thinking is going to be because you're open to opportunities. Opportunities have served you. So do you default to yes? Have you noticed that?
Well, I think you raise a really good and a really interesting point, Vanessa. I actually think in some ways that this is a question of needing to adapt our strategy with time, because early in our career, yes is almost always the right answer, because you know what? You don't have anything going on. What else are you going to say? Like, oh, no, I'd just rather stay home by myself. Like, of course, take the meeting. Of course, figure it out. You'll learn something, even if what you learn is like, this is terrible. You've learned something. But later on, you are busy. You're starting to be sought out. You know, that you have people lining up. And so I think one of the hardest parts, because nobody ever taps you on the shoulder and tells you, you have to figure this out for yourself, is ultimately there is a tipping point in your calendar where you start getting busy enough that the default shouldn't be yes anymore. The default should be no. And you have to keep recalibrating over time as you get older, as you get more contacts, as you get more successful.
So I think that this last question, I think sometimes actually it's hard for me to think about, should I be doing this task at all? Because I'm so in the weeds. So another strategy for folks listening is just focus on the last question. If I were to start fresh today, what projects would I choose to invest in? So if you just ask yourself that question, what bigger projects do you think are going to serve you 1 year, 5 year, and 10 years down the line? I think you mentioned, I have this quote that we need to think in decades. We overestimate what we can accomplish in a day and underestimate what we can accomplish in a year. Tell me how we can I think that last question, I was like that last question bridges my decade thinking. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. Well, certainly the first part of the equation, everyone's familiar with, right? I mean, you have your to-do list and it's, got 47 things on it, and we are shocked that we do not get through it. And, we're always frustrated with ourselves. But it's also true that I have experienced in terms of, clients that I work with and just, folks that I know, oftentimes people feel hindered from even coming up with a long-term goal because they say, well, that might be nice, but I wouldn't know how to do that. How could I possibly get there? And, it feels impossible. But the reason it feels impossible is because, yes, it's impossible today. If it was your goal, like, oh yeah, I'm going to be an astronaut tomorrow. Like, no, that's not going to happen. Right. But if you come up with sort of, whatever the equivalent is of like, I'm going to do X in 10 years or 20 years, there is so much time in between here and there. The amazing secret that I think most people don't realize is you don't have to know how to get there. I mean, even if you knew how to get there, like right now, is it even rational to think that every single one of the 10,000 steps that you map out between now and the year 2045 is going to pan out exactly the way you think? Like, I doubt it. A lot of things happening in the world. So you don't have to know. All you need to know is what the ambition is and what the next step is. And you just keep taking one step in front of another. And eventually you actually either get there or you get pretty darn close.
So the one thing I love about the book is you give really practical examples. So we're talking in theory here. You actually work through exactly how you achieve this with some incredible goals. I mean, everything from your business to a jazz record to other people's races and business goals. So we're talking in theory, but actually this is working for you and for others. And there's another way to think about this, which I think is almost less intimidating, which is you say, decide what to be bad at. So maybe, okay, you're thinking about the goal, you're thinking about the ambition, what can you achieve in a decade? Another way to think about this is what can you decide to be bad at? So Dorie, how did you come up with that? And can you walk us through a little bit of how someone can decide to be bad at something?
Absolutely. Well, I came up with it the best way possible, which is I borrowed it from somewhere else. I always like creative borrowing, but specifically where I borrowed it from is there's a Harvard Business School professor named Frances Fry who wrote a book with her partner, Ann Morris, called Uncommon Service. And it was specifically a book intended for the service industry, banks or airlines or whatever, whoever serves customers directly. And it was trying to understand the question of why most businesses were just kind of, not terrible, but just like super average. Nah, right? Yeah. Everybody wants to be great, obviously, but it is really hard to do it. And what they discovered is that ultimately the biggest reason why people, very few companies are able to achieve greatness is that they refuse to make strategic choices about what to be bad at. Everybody loves to say, oh, I'm going to be great at this. But then they somehow have this magical thinking that you can be great at this and then fine at everything else. No, actually, there is only so much time in the world, and you have a limited amount of time and money and energy. If you're going to be great at something, you need to be bad at something else. But because people were so reluctant to choose, it meant they were just average at everything. So I applied this to our own lives, to our own careers. We need to be willing to make choices. And in fact, I was just interviewing on my weekly Newsweek show, our mutual friend, Jenny Blake, who was talking about this very question. And she was explaining that her personal choice, as you probably experienced, is that she chooses to be bad at email. And indeed, she does take quite a while. And you know what? That's a smart strategic move, because it's not that she's trying to be good at it and she's failing. She's actually choosing and saying, you know what? I'm allocating the energy elsewhere.
Okay. So by the way, this concept is so powerful, the more specific you can get with it. So I hope that with this video, you're taking some notes. So one is, I hope you wrote down those 4 task questions. I hope you're actually using those with your task. Second, I wanted you to make that list, remember, of what would you, if you're starting fresh today, what would you invest in? This is the third thing I think that we should write down is, what's your list of what you want to be bad at? Like completely accepting and working at how bad you are. An example, personal example for me, and I had sort of kind of been doing this, but after I read it in your book, I was like, no, I'm going to actually make this a real thing, which is I am terrible at anything image or visual related. I'm very good at teaching. I love curriculum. My slides, a mess. I can have ideas for social, trying to design the layout of it, horrible. And forever I've been trying to do it. And so after reading your book, I sent an email to my team and I said, hey, I'm really bad at design and I want to stay bad at design. Is someone on the team really good at design where I can send you my slides? They'll be just black and white and you can just make them look great. And one of my team members was like, yes, I took a design course on the side and I would love to do it. So I also think this is making a list about what you strategically and purposely want to be bad at, and then finding help for those things, right? Like who can help you fill in the blank? Like I know that Jenny, she's bad at email, but she has systems to replace her badness at email. Right?
Indeed. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of free time is she's built up systems for it. That's right. I mean, When I moved to Miami, I realized, I've never been very good at cooking. In New York, there's so many little places, little lunch spots and whatever. You could just literally walk out the door and 2 feet away, there's a place to buy something. So I would just do that that I would have lunch like that all the time. In Miami, I live in an area where that's possible, but it's not as many kind of quick casual restaurants. It's more like places to sit and eat, which I don't actually have time for. Yeah. So I investigated, I put in the time up front, found a private chef and have meal delivery. Now, I realize not everybody can do that, but as we just think about allocating our time and our choices, I could be spending the time cooking delicious, healthy meals, but if we're choosing time or money, I'm at the point, thankfully, where I would rather choose the time and I will spend the money to buy back my time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so please make that list and also decide, is it time or money, right? Can someone else do it? Should you be doing it all? What can you be bad at? I want to shift gears a little bit into, you have 2 really interesting parts of the book where you talk about this in a strategic way. I also think there's benefits for your charisma and your connections, specifically this idea of optimizing for interesting. There are so many positive benefits of this. So I was hoping you could explain the concept in terms of long-term thinking. And then we could maybe talk about how there's also so many ricochet benefits from optimizing for interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, in our culture, of course, I feel like there is a lot of talk, as you might imagine, about, well, what's it all for? How do we make choices? Yeah. But I feel like there's kind of too much of a polarity, right? Because the conversation is often framed in a very simplistic way, which is, oh, well, you either choose to optimize for money and then you become an investment banker, or you optimize for meaning and you go to work for Habitat for Humanity or something like that. There's really like not a lot of middle ground.
Yeah, it's true. There's like two paths. That's it. Yes, I agree. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, God bless, like if you feel called to either one of those extremes, amazing, perfect. But for many of us, neither one really quite fits. Instead, I want to offer up another frame that I feel like may be more useful for at least some people, which is optimized for interesting. Now, interesting may be incredibly meaningful or it may be incredibly lucrative. But ultimately, if we want to have a life that keeps us engaged, that keeps us motivated, if what we are seeking out is something that is interesting to us, I feel like in a lot of ways we can't go wrong, because you know what, if it stops being interesting, that's okay. You can pick something else. But there's so many people that I run into who just, they're like, oh, I'm in a rut. Oh, I feel so stuck. This is so common, and it really doesn't have to be that way. If we, begin to think about, okay, how can I make choices? Now, I understand maybe you can't quit your job, but maybe in how you spend your free time, instead of doing the same thing every Saturday night or whatever, you're optimizing for interesting and making a different choice. There's different possibilities that we can tap into.
And that also, which is incredible, is the best way to be more charismatic. I think if you're doing interesting things, you have more confidence in yourself because you find yourself interesting. It also gives you interesting stories, things to talk about, which then builds your network. And that brings me to this next question, which you share this really interesting study. I believe the researcher was Gino, I think that maybe was right, about networking. And I think that this idea of creating an interesting life and making interesting choices and using that as a frame, I think that the myth they have about strategic thinking is everything has to be a pro and con list, which is going to make the most money, which is going to be most optimal. But actually, one of those variables should be what's the most interesting. And that can often be a tiebreaker. So with that frame that makes you more interesting, which makes you more interesting to other people, can you walk me through this Gino study about networking and why we should maybe think about adding that into our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for teeing that up, Vanessa. What you're referring to is Francesca Gino at the Harvard Business School did a very interesting study with some colleagues a few years ago about networking, and specifically why and how networking makes us feel, I say us, many people, it makes us feel dirty. And I think a lot of people can relate to that, right? That, you even bring up networking, and inevitably you're going to hear some people who are like, I hate networking.
Yes. It's like a physical, visceral reaction. Yes.
Yeah, you really do hear that. And what I have come to understand, the way they conduct these studies is like kind of hysterical, because they poll people about like their preferences and how desirable they feel certain objects are. And so after talking about networking, people rated like cleaning products like soap and toothpaste as like way more desirable. They're like, get it off me. It's super fascinating. But really, if you dig into the findings, what you discover is that it's not networking per se that people feel bad about or dislike. It's the idea of this kind of transactional behavior of using people. Now, to be clear, that's not all of networking. That is one facet. That's a stereotype of like basically bad networking. It's like, oh, hey, what can I get out of you? Right? Like nobody likes it, and nobody likes it for a reason. Good. Don't do it. That's terrible networking. So I think it's important to recognize that people actually felt fine. They felt fine when they were in an environment where the goal was to make friends, which is really what it should be anyway.
Yes. Yes. So the key, the frame here is as you begin to, I think, whatever your goals are, whatever visionary strategic thinking you have, you're going to need people, right? People are going to have to help you. You're going to work with people. You're going to need help from people. And so as that comes, you have this goal, you're going to need help. Think about not how can I get this help from someone? Think about how can I make friends in the right places? I think that slight mental shift, it makes us feel less dirty, makes us feel less needed for cleaning supplies, and it also gives a much more positive intention behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so right.
Okay, so I have one big framework I want to end on, which is, as you go into your life after this video, here's the last challenge I want to give you, which is you have 4 questions to decide if something is worth doing. So if you're like me and you default to yes, or you're a people pleaser and you say yes to too many things, here are the questions. And Dorie gives a ton of other examples and frameworks on how to do this. But just these 4 are going to get you started before you go buy the book. 1, here's what I want you to write these down. Say these. 1, what is the total time commitment? 2, what is the opportunity cost? 3, what's the physical and emotional cost? That's the good one. 4, would I feel bad in a year if I didn't do this? Dorie, I wanted to ask you, with these 4, are you so good at your time now that you don't even have to think about them? You've kind of figured out your flow, or do you still have to sort of check these off?
Oh, it's hard. I mean, this is always a little bit of a lifelong struggle, right? Because you want to be a nice person, and the hard part is not saying no to truly bad and terrible offers, right? Like, we're smart enough for that. The problem is saying no to the kind of middling offers where it's like, well, it could be helpful. I don't want to dismiss it, like, and you kind of talk yourself into it. So I really do try to use this as a checklist. And in fact, I'm in the process right now of, speaking of systems, of handing my inbox over to my assistant and creating, these sort of protocols, because frankly, it's easier for him to say no based on the protocol than it is for me. That's like, oh, but this might upset Sally, and she's really like so nice, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, no, it doesn't fit your criteria. You can't do it.
Okay. So you just tickled something uncomfortable in me, which means I have to do it, which is, I've been thinking about giving away my inbox too. Are you doing it? Are you going to do it?
I'm on the cusp. What I'm trying to do, right? And in fact, my plan is to do it this weekend. I've got my inbox down, and not everybody has to do it this way, obviously, but I've got my inbox down to, let's see, right this moment, it is at 62 messages. And so I want it to get to inbox 0. So there's not like old things clogging that, that like they've been clogging for a reason. So I need to deal with them personally, but I want to give him a fresh start. But as soon as I can do that, which I think I can do that over the next few days, I am going to hand it to him so that he's dealing with it fresh. I've created a sort of systems manual, which obviously is going to be built out and bulked up over time. And at first, he'll probably hand a bunch of it back to me because he doesn't know what to do. But the goal is over time for him to be able to triage. I mean, let's hope maybe 80% of it.
Okay, you've inspired me. So my big action step is I'm going to work on my system to give away my inbox. Maybe, Dorie, you could do like a post about that or something, or like the framework of your manual. I don't even know where to begin. Maybe you could do that. I want everyone to think of your action step or challenge. Like, what's the one thing other than buying the book that you're going to do after this video to begin to add some strategic thinking, time, and purpose into your life, to begin to think about your life in terms of not just days or even months, but years and decades. Dorie, do you have any last minute words of wisdom for us?
Thank you so much, Vanessa. It's so great to have the chance to talk with you. And I'll just mention for folks who want to dive in even more, the book is The Long Game, and you can get a free long game strategic thinking self-assessment if you'd like it at DorieClark.com/thelonggame.
Okay, we'll put all that in the show notes. My folks love a strategic assessment. Like, we love a quiz. So like, that is perfect for us. So everyone should go take that quiz. That's a super easy way to do it. Dorie, I want to thank you so much for your wonderful time, for entering into my life. You were so supportive during my book launch. It's such an honor and privilege to help get your work into the world. And I think we're new friends now. Like, we're new friends.
We are homies. Okay. I am so excited to actually get to hang out in person, Vanessa. That'll be great.
Oh my goodness. I thank you so much, everyone, for watching. If you like this video, give it a like, take some action steps, and I'll see you in our next video. Bye.
Don't forget to check out all of these goodies.